Hi, my name is Michaela Rao, and today we're going to be talking about the skull, brain, and everything in between. So, first, I'm going to go over the anatomy of the skull, and here's a picture of the anterior view of the skull. And the bones that make up the anterior view also make up the structure of our face. So, starting with number 1, we have the frontal bone, 2 is the nasal, 3 is the lacrimal, 4 is the palatine. 5 is the zygomatic, and that is like around our cheek area. 6 is the maxilla. 7 is the vomer. 8 is the mandible, or around like our jaw area and our jawline. 9 is the inferior nasal concha. 10 is the ethmoid. And 11 is the sphenoid. Now we have the lateral view of the skull. So there are three bones that are shown in the lateral view but not shown in the anterior view, which are in red, and then the numbers in yellow are just a repeat of the anterior view bones, but that can also be seen in the lateral view. So I just want to give you guys two different spatial images. So I accidentally skipped number 12. I just forgot to write it, and I started with 13, but that doesn't really matter in the order of the structure shown, so we're just going to skip 12. But 13 is the parietal, 14 is the occipital, and 15 is the temporal bone. And then 16, as shown in the anterior view, is the sphenoid, 17 is the lacrimal, 18 is the ethmoid, 19 is the nasal, 20 is the zygomatic, 21 is the maxilla, 22 is the mandible. Then now we're going to go into the bones of the orbit and look closely at that. So the orbit is made up of 6 bones that make up the eye socket area in the anterior view. And these bones are the frontal bone, the sphenoid, the lacrimal, the ethmoid, the maxilla, and the zygomatic. But to trick you guys, and also not to trick you guys, it's really important to know that there are actually not 6 bones. There's only 6 bones that make up on the anterior view, but there are actually 7 bones in total that make up the orbit socket. And that 7th bone is the palatine bone, and that's not shown in the anterior view. Now, switching from the skull, we're going to go and move into the brain and the anatomy of the brain. So here's a narrated drawing of the lateral view, and please just ignore the fact that I'm not an artist and I really can't draw, but I tried my best trying to draw this view of the brain, and I think it turned out pretty well. I mean, it's still doable, and I'm sure you'll understand like what I'm trying to explain. So the brain is split into 4 lobes, and together all 4 lobes make up the cerebral cortex. And the 4 lobes are split down into the right and left hemisphere by the longitudinal fissure, but that can't be seen in the lateral view. That can only be seen in the if you're looking at it from top down. But I just wanted to give you guys that as a fun fact. So in the anterior cranial fossa is the frontal lobe, and that's primarily responsible for the control of language. Located in between the occipital and frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, and that's responsible for processing language and calculation, as well as visual spatial functions. On the posterior side of the cerebral cortex is the occipital lobe, and from its name we can infer that it's primarily responsible for visual processing. And then lastly, the temporal lobe, which is located in the medial cranial fossa, is primarily responsible for memory, language, and hearing. Inferior to the occipital lobe is the cerebellum, or another name for it, it can be called the little brain, because that's the second largest structure of the brain other than the cerebral cortex. And it's divided into 2 regions by the vermis. The cerebellum also has like a right and left hemisphere. And the cerebellum provides motor control for smooth, coordinated movements and the maintenance of posture. The brainstem is also composed of 3 parts. It has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So starting most superior of the brainstem is the midbrain, and it processes sight, sound, and triggers reflexes that are related to these senses. Inferior to the midbrain is the pons, and this structure connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. And then the most inferior is the medulla oblongata, and it's connects the brain to the spinal cord, as well as regulates autonomic functions like heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and digestion. Now I'm going to be drawing the sagittal view of the brain. Again, bear with me that this isn't the best drawing. I'm not Picasso or anything. I'm just a senior trying to show you guys this view. So along with the lateral view, there are structures that can be seen in the sagittal view. So if you cut open the brain and then you look at it from the side, and so these, as I'll be pointing out, you can see like the four lobes. So the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal lobe. And then you can also see the cerebellum and the brainstem, which is like the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. But what I mainly want to focus on in the sagittal view, which you cannot see in the lateral view, is the diencephalon. So that contains three structures: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. So once I'm done drawing all of the lateral view structures that can also be seen in the sagittal view, we're going to dive deep into the diencephalon, and I will be explaining exactly what those processes or what those structures do. It's pretty interesting. So I'm finishing up showing you guys the brainstem, which is the midbrain, the medulla oblongata, and the pons. And then now we're going to go up into the diencephalon. So one of the main areas is the lateral ventricle, but I'm not going to be talking about this too in depth because that's part of the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid circulation, and that's not a topic I'll be discussing in this lecture necessarily. But what I wanted to discuss is diencephalon. So like I said, it has the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. Thalamus processes sensory input. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system by regulating temperature, hunger, thirst, our circadian rhythm, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. And then the pituitary gland is a tiny gland in black, like I represented. It's an endocrine gland, so it secretes hormones, and it's also connected to the diencephalon via the infundibulum. Now we're going to go on to the meninges. So the meninges are protective membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord, and there are three layers of the meninges. So there's the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the outermost layer and lies directly underneath the bones of the skull, and its name translates to the hard mother because it's one of the main membranes that give the cushioning of the brain. The middle layer is called the arachnoid mater, and it lies directly underneath the dura mater and contains connective tissue. And the space beneath the arachnoid mater and right above the pia mater contains cerebrospinal fluid, which acts also as a cushion to the brain. And then the deepest and most thin layer is called the pia mater, and this layer adheres to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. Here's some cadaver images that I added to show you guys what exactly these matters look like. So on the picture on the left, we can see that the dura mater has been removed, and what's revealed is the arachnoid mater, and you can see that the layers get thinner as you go inferiorly, just because now you can kind of see the structure of the brain and that the brain is exposed. And so underneath the arachnoid mater is the pia mater, but since that's not dissected, you can't really see that, but it really shows a good image of the arachnoid mater. And then the image on the right shows the dura mater peeled back, and you can see that it is like a pretty thick membrane layer, and it exposes the brain. And what I really like on the picture on the right is something very unusual, or not unusual, but it's cool to see. So when the brain is exposed, you can see that the cerebrum is swollen with some pus accumulation, and that's just because in this picture specifically, the patient is suffering from meningitis. That just means that it's an inflammation of the meninges, or the layer of the membranes. But I chose these two pictures because I thought it would be a really good representation of what the membranes look like in person. The dura mater contains dural folds, which project into the fissures of the brain and help separate the different regions of the brain from each other. So the dura mater has two dural folds, and that's the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. The falx cerebri divides the cerebral hemispheres, and the tentorium cerebelli divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. The open spaces between the dura mater create venous sinuses, and this is where deoxygenated blood is collected and drains from the brain. The different sinuses are the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, transverse sinus, and what's not shown is the sigmoid sinus, but you can show that's going to be shown in the next slide. It just can't be seen in the lateral view, or in the sagittal view. So, the sigmoid sinus is like an S shaped. It's kind of like the sigmoid colon in our digestive system. So then we have the connecting point of the superior sagittal sinus and transverse sinus, and that's the confluence of sinuses. The blood drainage from the brain are here we're looking at the superior view at the top of the skull, and this gives you an accurate representation of how the deoxygenated blood drains. So, starting superior from the superior sagittal sinus, the deoxygenated blood goes from the superior sagittal sinus into the confluence of sinuses, then into the transverse sinus, to the sigmoid sinus. So you can see it's like an S shape. And then the blood drains out of the jugular foramen into the internal jugular vein. And there's also another sinus called the cavernous sinus that wraps around the pituitary gland and also drains into the jugular foramen. And then from the internal jugular foramen, the blood supply goes to the circle of Willis. And this is a circuit system where within the brain that connects the internal carotid arteries with the vertebral arteries and allows the blood to get to any part of the brain. So the internal carotid arteries go through an opening called the carotid canal, and the vertebral arteries go through an opening called the foramen magnum. So here I have a narrated drawing of the circle of Willis, including of all the arteries. So first the blood drains from the vertebral arteries and travels through the foramen magnum, and they merge together into the basilar arteries at the pons. The 6 main arteries that come off the circle of Willis, well, there's actually 3, but there's 2 on each side. So these arteries are the anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries. And so from the basilar artery, we can see that the blood then drains into the posterior cerebral artery, up into the middle cerebral artery, and then up into the anterior cerebral artery. And what connects the posterior and middle cerebral arteries are the posterior communicating, and then what connects the anterior cerebral arteries are the anterior communicating. So no matter what, there's always going to be blood circulation to and from the brain because of the circle of Willis, and that's a really cool aspect to have. So now that we've just learned a bunch within this lecture, I want to give a review quiz. So first we're going to match the structure of the eye orbit to its location, and as a bonus, we're going to see what bone is missing. So feel free to pause this video, but I'm going to go on and say the answers. So the number 1 is the frontal, number 2 is the sphenoid, 3 is the ethmoid, 4 is the lacrimal, 5 is the maxilla, and 6 is the zygomatic. And what bone is missing, since this is an anterior view, is the palatine bone. So if you got that right, give yourself a pat on the back. Question 2, match the membrane with its definition. So again, pause this video and try to do it on your own. But the answer to this is that the dura mater is the outermost layer and adheres to the surface of the skull. The arachnoid matter is the middle layer and underneath contains the cerebrospinal fluid. And the pia mater is the deepest and thinnest layer. Question 3, which pair of the dural fold and venous sinus with its incorrect anatomy is incorrect? Or with its corresponding anatomy is incorrect. So the answer is D, the transverse sinus and the sphenoid bone. So actually, it's not, the transverse sinus doesn't lie within the sphenoid, it lies within the tentorium cerebelli. Match what structures are the red arrows pointing to. So number 1 is the thalamus, and number 2 is the hypothalamus, and this is part of the diencephalon. Number 3 is pons, so part of the brainstem, and number 4 is the cerebellum. And you can see that the vermis splits the cerebellum into the right and left hemispheres, like I mentioned before. Lastly, what is the pathway of the venous drainage? The answer is that the deoxygenated blood from the drain, starting with the superior sagittal sinus, goes into the confluence of sinuses, into the transverse sinus, and then to the sigmoid, drains out of the jugular foramen into the internal jugular vein and to the circle of Willis, where the blood is then being circulated within all parts of the brain. Thank you.